Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. In today's episode, we're going to talk about moving from protest to power. We live in an age of protest. On campuses and public squares, in streets and social media, protesters all over the world are challenging the status quo. Protests can thrust new issues onto the local or national or even global agenda. And protests can certainly activate people who have long been on the sidelines of civic life. But while protest is often necessary for social change, it is rarely sufficient. What happens after the march, after the rally? In order for protests to bring about lasting positive change, a few things have to happen. Voters have to be mobilized. They have to then cast ballots. And then that has to change the composition and the priorities of government itself. Today, we're going to talk about three core strategies for converting the energy of protest into durable political change. First, expanding the frame of the possible. Second, choosing a defining fight. And third, finding an early win. Let's start with expanding the frame of the possible. Think about any issue you care about. Think about the change that you would like to see in the world. Now, how many times have you been told by somebody, well, that's just never going to happen. That's a nice thought, but that's wishful thinking. It's just not possible. In fact, it may or may not be possible. But when somebody says that to you, be very clear. What they are doing is they are trying to define the boundaries of your civic imagination. What the powerful citizen does is push back. The powerful citizen tries to expand the frame of the possible and to redefine the boundaries of civic imagination. The powerful citizen asks over and over again, what if? What if we did have an audacious goal? What if we did mobilize different forms of power, people power, money power, ideas power? What if we were able to mobilize those forms of power and get the results that we wanted? That act of imagining in the first place and being audacious about it and not taking as given the givens of contemporary political life is something that we've seen in the wake of all of the protests that started in Ferguson, Missouri, and have spread around the country and have built into a movement called Black Lives Matter. And in these protests, yes, there have been people who have been specifically arguing about police brutality and about changing the rules, but the protests have converted into something else. Some of these activists have gone on to push for new city council members or new prosecutors. Some have gone on to be parts of commissions that are building new policy frameworks for social justice and racial justice. Some are even running for office. But one particularly audacious and imaginative example of converting protest to power is something called Campaign Zero. Campaign Zero was started by 4 members of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they have decided to set this big goal to reduce down to 0 the number of police killings of unarmed civilians. 0. Now, they're doing this not simply by setting that goal, but by laying out an entire robust agenda of policy changes, local, state, and national, and an agenda of things that we, the people, as citizens, have to learn to do differently in relation to one another and in relation to law enforcement. That work of expanding the frame of the possible in Campaign Zero is both imaginative and concrete. And it's the concreteness that is really important in coming to our second strategy here, choosing a defining fight. Now, one of the things about a defining fight in any issue is simply this. People don't think about politics in the abstract. They don't think about civic issues merely in theory. They think about them in contrast and relief, A versus B. And so on any issue, the question is, how do you frame the choice? How do you frame the issue in ways that are most advantageous to your side? Define that terrain and confine the other side to the least advantageous terrain. Consider an issue like immigration, illegal immigration in particular. People who are opposed to and fearful of illegal immigration have really done an excellent job of reducing down this question to a single word, which is calling the people who are undocumented and unauthorized immigrants illegals. By calling somebody an illegal, you're doing a few things. You're humanizing this issue, which is complicated and full of a lot of policy, into a single person, but you're defining that person as inherently a lawbreaker. Their very personhood, not just their acts, but their very personhood is a threat to the rule of law and a threat to our security. That notion of a person as illegal is one framing. On the other side, though, you have a group of young activists called the Dreamers. Dreamers are young, undocumented activists who have been pushing for something called the DREAM Act, which would give people who were brought to this country at a young age, illegally, but have essentially only known this country give them a pathway to citizenship if they're willing to go to college or serve in the military. And this idea then of reframing the immigration debate and the debate around illegal immigration as dreamers and aspiration, as opposed to threats posed by illegals crossing our border, creates this contrast and this definition of a choice. Now, wherever you may sit on this issue, the fact is that both sides have been very effective at trying to personify and humanize the issue in a way that defines terms to their advantage. And that is crucial. It's not just the abstract, it's making a choice. Now, the third strategy then of converting protest to power builds on that, and that is finding an early win. Take, for instance, the rise of the Tea Party. When the Tea Party came to power and came to prominence in the wake of the financial collapse in the United States, they did a whole bunch of things. They didn't just start out saying, we want to wholesale change the relationship of government to the economy. They first started by showing up at congressional town meetings and dominating those town meetings in a way that got a lot of media attention. Then they started running local candidates for local offices. Then they started in primaries challenging incumbent members of Congress. And as they did these things, one by one, they created the sense of momentum that began to build ultimately into a takeover of the House of Representatives and a shift not only in the Republican Party, but a shift in the frame of what was possible in Congress and in national politics. That same kind of building and momentum from small victories to larger ones, taking partial wins and turning them into bigger ones, is really also the story of the marriage equality movement in the United States. Today, that's the law of the land. But it didn't start out that way. It started out with activists decades ago deciding they're going to make a fight in a city, maybe in a state. And not a fight for full-on marriage equality initially, but a fight, for instance, for civil unions in one jurisdiction. And that win could piggyback onto another so that as a city decided, yes, we are going to authorize gay marriage, states started doing the same thing. And all of these things created this global sense of victory that involved mobilizing voters, pressuring legislators, changing social norms so that ultimately the United States Supreme Court had to rule in favor of marriage equality. Now, however you may feel about the Tea Party or about marriage equality, the fact is that in both cases, these movements have been successful at converting the energy of protests and marches and anger in the streets to small wins that add up to bigger wins. And that is the arc of activity in converting protest to power.